The first thing you need to know is that nobody would say his name at church. Not on that particular Sunday in October of 1853. Not in the warm air of that Mississippi morning, with the light coming through the high windows at the angle that made the dust visible and made the congregation look, for a few minutes each week, as though they were sitting inside something holy. Not while the pews were full of the families of Rankin County, the Greers in their usual position near the front, the Bowens 4 rows back on the right side, the Whitmore family filling most of a row on the left, all of them dressed correctly, sitting correctly, performing the specific social ritual that Sunday service in a Planter County church required. Nobody said his name. But from the moment Reverend Eustace Coleman took his text and began the sermon that everyone in that room had come to hear, or had come knowing they would be unable to avoid, the name was in the room anyway. Sitting in the spaces between Coleman's carefully chosen words. Present in the way that certain topics are present in a room full of people who have agreed, without agreeing, not to name them directly. A man named Holloway, seated in the 3rd row, watched his wife. Thomas Bowen, 4 rows behind him, watched his. Garrett Whitmore stared at the pulpit with the fixed expression of a man who is not listening to the sermon because he already knows what the sermon means and is thinking about what comes next. Coleman said, "What enters through an unguarded door does not arrive wearing the face of danger." In the second pew from the front, a woman named Catherine Pryor looked down at her gloves. She smoothed the left one. Then she smoothed the right one. She did not look up for the remainder of the sermon. This is where you enter the story of Rankin County in the autumn of 1853. Not at the beginning. There is no clean beginning to find. You enter here at this church, in this already damaged atmosphere, with a sermon in progress about a man no one will name and a room full of people who are performing composure with varying degrees of success. Somewhere at the edge of the Alderman property, roughly 4 miles from this church, the man nobody would name was working. He had been working since before the sun was up. He would be working when the service ended and the congregation filed out into the warm October air and the conversations began in low voices in the churchyard, in the language of people who have understood a message and are now discussing its implications. His name was Elijah Reed. And by October of 1853, simply having that name in Rankin County had become its own kind of crime. To understand what Rankin County was, you have to understand what it was trying to be. The cotton economy of the American South in 1853 was not merely an economic system. It was a theological argument. It rested on a claim, not always stated openly, sometimes stated in the language of providence or natural order or the simple weight of things as are, that the people who held wealth and land and legal authority held these things because they were meant to hold them. That the arrangement of the world was not arbitrary. That the man seated at the head of the plantation house table was there by right, and that the people who served that table were there by something equally predetermined and equally permanent. The plantation houses that anchored this argument were built to make you feel it before you heard it. The approach roads were designed for maximum visual effect. The columns were proportioned to dwarf the visitor. The windows were tall because tall windows implied ceilings that implied space that implied resources, and resources implied authority, and authority was the entire point. You were meant to arrive at these houses already understanding your position relative to their owners. The women who lived inside these houses occupied a space that was simultaneously central and peripheral. Central because the house, its management, its social calendar, its domestic operations, was their domain, and the house was the argument's most visible evidence. Peripheral because their domain was a theater set, and the play being staged was not about them. Their education had been cultivated for this purpose. Enough refinement to perform the appropriate register of the household, not enough breadth to make them restless with the performance. Their social lives were governed by protocols that were less explicit than legal codes and more binding. Their emotional lives were monitored by the collective attention of the county's social network, which was as comprehensive and as unforgiving as any surveillance architecture has ever been. The result, in many of these women, was a condition that had no name in 1853 because the people who could have named it were not permitted to speak about it publicly. A narrowness. A constriction. The particular hunger that develops in people who are given everything a house can provide and nothing the self requires. It is important to understand this hunger before Elijah Reed enters the story. It is important to understand what people starve for, before you introduce a man whose simple quality of attention looks, in a famine, exactly like food. The enslaved people who moved through this world operated under different and far heavier constraints, but they shared one structural feature with the women in the plantation houses. Their survival depended on reading. On the sustained, patient, granular work of understanding the people around them. What moods meant, what silences predicted, what the gap between a man's words and his body carried as information, what the precise quality of a pause before a name was spoken indicated about what was coming. This was not what the county's social hierarchy would have recognized as intelligence. It was not oratory or scholarship. It was older and more fundamental, the capacity to understand human behavior through sustained attention to it. Elijah Reed had this capacity in unusual measure. He had not chosen to develop it. It had been made in him, the way all essential things are made in people by the specific conditions of his survival. He was born in 1819 on a Virginia tobacco plantation. Sold at 14, separated from his mother, from his sister, from everything that constituted the social geography of his world, and moved through 2 other households before arriving at the Alderman Plantation in Rankin County in the early 1840s. He was in his early 30s before the county had occasion to notice him, and by then he had spent 20 years in the school that separation and sale and the daily management of other people's power constitutes. He had emerged from it with something that different observers described in different terms. Some called it composure. Some called it a kind of impenetrable quiet. One man, the attorney from Natchez who would spend the summer of 1853 watching the county build its story, described it afterward as the quality of a man who had learned to think before he spoke, which sounds simple and is in practice so rare that most people, encountering it, do not recognize it for what it is. What it actually was, in plainest terms, was this: when you spoke to Elijah Reed, he listened to you. Not the performance of listening, not the tilted head and the waiting expression that people use while composing their response. He was actually present with what you were saying. He received it. He thought about it before responding. This is a small thing stated plainly. It does not sound like the engine of a county's psychological collapse. That is because you have never lived in a world where no one does it. The Alderman Plantation occupied 800 acres in the central section of Rankin County. The main house was 2-story white-painted frame construction, with a front gallery that faced south and caught the evening breeze that the Mississippi summer occasionally, mercifully offered. The stable yard was set back from the house on the eastern side, connected to the main structure by a service path that ran past the kitchen garden and a stand of pecan trees that were, in a good year, the most productive thing on the property. Cornelius Alderman, who held the deed and the people, was 51 years old. He had inherited more than he had built, and he managed what he had inherited with the mixture of confidence and inattention that inherited wealth reliably produces. He was not a notable man. He had strong opinions about cotton prices and weak opinions about most other things, and he held both kinds with identical conviction. His wife Frances was 38. She managed the house with a precision that most visitors interpreted as contentment, and that was, in fact, the precision of a woman whose management of the house was the only domain in which her precision was permitted expression. She had been married 19 years. She had, at some point in the middle of those years, stopped expecting the marriage to be something other than what it was. These are the people Elijah Reed worked among. He had been working among them for more than a decade. In the ledger books, he was a notation, a reliable element of the operational system, the man you called when the carriage needed work or the horse needed management. In the actual life of the property, he was something more specific than that, and more complicated, though no ledger book was designed to record what that specificity was. He repaired things. He was extraordinary at it. Not because of any physical facility beyond what the work required, but because he approached a broken thing the way he approached everything else. With patience, with attention, with the specific curiosity of someone who genuinely wants to understand why something failed before they attempt to fix it. One of the house workers on the Alderman property, an older man named Hector who had known Elijah since his arrival, said this about him years later, in the testimony that forms one of the few direct windows into Elijah's character from someone who actually knew him. He never rushed to repair. Other men, they'd get in there and fix the obvious thing and be done. Elijah would sit with whatever was broken and study it first. He'd say, "You fixed the second break before you understand the first. You haven't fixed anything. You've just moved the trouble somewhere you can't see." This is what Elijah Reed was. A man who looked at broken things with patient attention until he understood where they had first given way. The county was about to decide that this quality made him dangerous. Her name was Frances, and she had been taking the same morning walk for 4 years. The route ran south from the house, through the kitchen garden, along the eastern path past the pecan stand, and then turned back before reaching the stable yard. It took approximately 40 minutes. It gave her 40 minutes of the day in which she was, nominally, alone, in which the performance requirements of the household were briefly suspended, in which she could walk at whatever pace she chose without reference to anyone else's need or schedule. Sometime in the summer of 1852, the route began extending itself. Not dramatically. Not as a decision she made consciously. Simply as the small daily evolution of habit that happens when something at a particular distance starts, over time, to exert a kind of gravity. The path past the pecan trees continued a few yards beyond where it had previously turned. Then a few yards more. By late summer, her 40-minute walk was 45 minutes, and its terminus was close enough to the stable yard that if someone were working there, if a particular person were working there, the sound of the work would carry. She did not think of this as choosing to be near him. She thought of it as the walk having found its natural distance. This distinction will matter later. She had spoken with Elijah Reed perhaps a dozen times over the decade of his presence on the property, transactional exchanges, mostly about carriage maintenance and harness repairs, and the quarterly inventories she supervised. He was part of the operational texture of her household, which meant he was simultaneously present and invisible in the way that all the people who made a plantation house function were simultaneously present and invisible. The first time she had a conversation that did not fit that category was on a morning in late July of 1852. She had been walking. He had been working on a wheel assembly near the stable yard entrance and had not seen her approaching, or had seen her and had not adjusted his posture in the way that workers tended to adjust their posture, the slight recalibration toward deference, when the mistress of the house was approaching. He was simply working, with complete absorption in what he was doing. She had stopped without deciding to stop. She had watched him for a moment before he became aware of her, and in that moment she observed something she had not expected to observe. He was happy. Not the performed contentment of a worker in the presence of the household that owned him. Something quieter and more genuine, the specific satisfaction of a person fully engaged in something that requires them. She had asked, somewhat startled by her own question, "Does the work ever feel like something other than work?" He had looked up then. He had looked at her, not with anything improper, not with any quality of transgression, but with the simple directness of a man who had been asked a genuine question and was genuinely considering how to answer it. He said, "When I understand something at the end that I didn't understand at the beginning, then it feels like something other than work." She had walked back to the house thinking about that sentence. She thought about it in pieces for the rest of the week. She did not tell Cornelius about the conversation. There was nothing to tell, she told herself. A brief exchange with a worker during a morning walk. Nothing more. But she went back. The route kept extending. Her name was Adelaide, and she had too much mind for the life available to her. She was 22 years old, the daughter of Garrett Whitmore, a man whose emotional volume was inversely proportional to his depth of thought, and she had been raised in a household where intelligence in a daughter was tolerated as long as it made itself invisible and served no practical purpose. She read constantly. She thought carefully about what she read. She had learned to do both in a way that left no external evidence, which was its own kind of intelligence. She encountered Elijah Reed on a September morning in 1852 on the Eastern Field Road, farther from the house than she usually walked, in a direction she could not have fully explained if asked. He was examining a section of fence that had come down in a storm, not yet repairing it, simply standing before it with his hands at his sides and the expression of a man solving a problem in his head before committing his hands to it. She stopped. She asked, with the slightly awkward directness of someone who has spent most of her life not speaking what she actually thinks, what he was looking at. He said, "Which section gave way first? If I start with the second break, I've misunderstood the whole thing." She understood immediately that he was describing something beyond fence construction. She did not say this. He probably did not intend for her to understand it that way. But she understood it that way, and the understanding landed in her with the specific force of something she had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, to hear. That the problem of understanding a broken system requires starting at the correct origin point. That superficial repair is not repair. That precision matters and most people skip it. She walked home thinking he was talking about the fence. She walked home thinking he was also talking about everything. Over the following weeks, she found herself on the Eastern Field Road with increasing frequency. She told herself she liked the walk. The walk was genuinely pleasant. This was true and also insufficient as an explanation, and she knew it was insufficient, though she did not examine the insufficiency too closely. What she was looking for, on those walks, was the specific experience of being heard by someone who was not performing the act of hearing. She was looking for the conversation that had happened once to happen again. She was looking for evidence that the thing she had briefly encountered was real and not a single anomaly. This is not romance. It is worth naming precisely what this is. A young woman with a formidable mind and no legitimate outlet for it, who has briefly encountered someone who seemed to recognize that the mind was present, and who is now looking for confirmation that the recognition was not accidental. The county would tell this story differently. The county would tell this story as a story about a young woman in dangerous proximity to an enslaved man. The county's version would be simpler and more frightening and completely wrong about what was actually happening. Her name was Ruth, she was 62 years old, and she had no interest in being added to the county's inventory of women whose composure had been disturbed by Elijah Reed. She had buried a husband. She had buried 2 children. She had arrived at a place in her life where she was done performing emotions she did not feel and equally done performing the absence of emotions she did feel. She had spoken with Elijah at a gathering at the Alderman House in the autumn of 1852, had found herself in the stable yard during a social visit, had asked him something reflexively about the work, and had received, instead of the reflexive deflection she expected, an actual answer. He had said, in response to her polite inquiry about whether the work ever became tedious, "Repetition without attention gets tedious. Repetition with attention is something different." She had stood with that sentence for 3 days. Not because she was infatuated. Not because anything about the exchange was inappropriate. But because she recognized, with the clarity of a woman who has been alive long enough to recognize things, that she was hearing articulated something she had believed for decades and never found language for. And that the person who had provided the language was a man doing stable work in Mississippi in 1853, which meant that the county's picture of who was intelligent and who was not, who was worth attending to and who was not, was wrong in a way that it did not have the equipment to discover. Ruth Chastain did not go looking for Elijah Reed after that conversation. She did not extend her walks or find reasons to visit the Alderman property. She was 62 years old and she had learned the cost of things. But she thought about the sentence. For a long time. And when the county's noise about him finally reached a pitch she could no longer ignore, she would be one of the few people in it who understood what the noise was actually about. Her name was Winifred Coleman, the Reverend's wife, 44 years old, and her situation was the most specifically painful of any of the women in this story. She was a deeply religious woman. Not performed religion, not the Sunday service religion that the county wore like appropriate clothing, but genuine faith, the kind that lives in the body and asks difficult questions of itself in the dark. She had built her life around a moral architecture that she believed in and tried to maintain, and the maintenance required constant work in ways that she understood and accepted. She had spoken with Elijah Reed once. Only once. During a brief encounter in the summer of 1853, after the county's story about him had already begun to accumulate, after she had already heard the whispers and the warnings, when their paths had crossed during an errand near the Alderman property. He had been polite. He had been completely unremarkable. He had said perhaps 15 words. And she had walked away from that 15-word exchange in a state of confusion that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with what his absolute unremarkableness in the presence of the county's enormous story about him had revealed to her. She had expected to feel something corresponding to the warnings. She had felt nothing of the kind. She had felt only the disorienting sensation of a story and a reality that did not match. This mismatch frightened her more than the story would have. Because if the story was wrong about Elijah, then the people telling the story, her husband among them, were generating fear without legitimate cause. And the implications of that, for what her husband would stand in the pulpit and say to the county, and for what it meant that she would sit in the second pew and hear him say it, were implications she could not follow to their conclusion without arriving somewhere she was not ready to go. She said nothing about this. She sat in her pew. She smoothed her gloves. The county's story was not equipped to hold what she actually felt. It had no category for a minister's wife who understood, in private, that the monster was a fiction. Her name was Margaret Sayers and she was the woman who nearly destroyed everything. She was 36, the wife of a plantation attorney named Edward Sayers, and she was the woman the county would later identify as having defended Elijah too emotionally at a social gathering in July of 1853, a phrase that tells you everything about how the county processed what she said and nothing about what she actually said. What she actually said was this: that she had spoken with Elijah Reed on 2 occasions and that she had found no basis for the alarm being expressed, and that if the alarm was based on the claim that he had engaged in improper behavior, then someone ought to be required to say specifically what the improper behavior was rather than speaking in the general accumulated language of influence and disruption that was currently filling the county's social atmosphere. She said this at a dinner hosted by the Greers in July. She said it in the presence of Walter Greer, Garrett Whitmore, Thomas Bowen, and their wives, plus 3 other couples, and the attorney from Natchez. The room's response told her exactly what the room thought of her contribution. Edward Sayers, who was seated next to her, touched her arm. It was a light touch and it said, "Stop." She stopped. But she had said it. The words were in the room. And the county, which had been building its story with great care and some investment, did not receive this intrusion well. What it did with the intrusion was to fold Margaret Sayers into the story itself, to add her name to the list of women who had been affected, whose judgment was therefore compromised, whose defense of him was itself evidence of the problem she was claiming did not exist. This is the mechanism at its most elegant and most terrible. The story protects itself from contradiction by incorporating the contradiction as further evidence. The woman who says there is no monster is added to the list of women the monster has touched. The circle closes. The argument becomes impossible to enter. Margaret Sayers understood this had happened within 48 hours of the dinner. She did not attempt to re-enter the argument. She was an attorney's wife and she recognized a closed system when she encountered one. But she was angry. In private, in the rooms of her own house where the anger was permitted, she was furious in the specific way of someone who has watched reason be defeated by machinery and knows there is currently no tool available to her to reverse it. That anger would matter later. Not loudly. Nothing loud was available to women in 1853 Mississippi, but in the particular, patient, underground way that constrained people have always found for their anger when the direct channel is closed. Thomas Bowen had known something was wrong since the summer of 1852. Not wrong in a way he could describe. Not wrong with anything specific he could point to. Wrong in the way that a careful man knows when the atmosphere of his household has shifted by some increment too small to identify but large enough to register. Like a sound you cannot locate but cannot stop hearing. His wife Martha was the same woman she had always been. She performed all the same functions. She attended all the same gatherings. She was not visibly different in any way he could inventory. But she had used the word unusual and he had heard it, and he had done what men of his type do with information they cannot categorize. He had set it down and waited to see whether it connected to something. By March of 1853, when Garrett Whitmore made his oblique comment at dinner about the eastern portion of the Alderman property line, it connected. Thomas Bowen was not a violent man. This is worth establishing. He did not respond to the connection he had made with the emotional velocity of Franklin Cass or the performative outrage of Whitmore. He responded with something colder and more deliberate. He began gathering information. Quietly, systematically, through the commercial and social networks available to a cotton factor in Rankin County. He asked questions that didn't seem like questions. He listened in the spaces of conversations that seemed to be about other things. By May he had assembled a picture. The picture was imprecise, assembled from impressions and second-hand accounts and the always unreliable products of social gossip. But it had a shape. And the shape alarmed him, not because of what it said about Elijah Reed but because of what it said about the number of women in the county who seemed to have experienced something similar to whatever his wife had experienced. He understood, at some level, that this pattern was diagnostic of something he did not want to diagnose. He did not pursue that level. He stayed at the surface, where the diagnosis was simpler and required nothing of him. There was a man, and the man was a problem, and the problem needed addressing. This is the story Bowen told himself. It was easier than the other story. The other story involved examining what his wife had been searching for in that unusual conversation, and what that search implied about what she was not finding elsewhere, and that was a door Thomas Bowen was not equipped to open. Garrett Whitmore occupied a different position entirely. He was the loudest man in the county on most subjects, and the subject of Elijah Reed was no exception. But his loudness here had a specific quality that differed from his usual register. A quality of performance, of a man who has decided what he feels and is now performing that feeling at a volume intended to prevent anyone from looking too closely at what is actually underneath it. What was underneath it was primarily Adelaide. His daughter had changed. He could not say precisely when or precisely how, but she was different from the girl she had been, and the difference was located in some interior space he had never fully had access to and was now further from than ever. She was quieter in ways that felt fuller, not emptier. She read more than she had and with greater focus. She had opinions, not the decorative opinions that young women of her station were permitted, but opinions that had origins he couldn't trace, that seemed to come from a place inside her that he had not been aware existed. He did not connect this directly to Elijah Reed. He was not a man who tracked the daily geography of his own household with any precision. But when the county story assembled itself and Adelaide was part of the landscape the story moved through, something in him recognized, in the way that uncomfortable recognitions happen below articulation, in the body before the mind, that whatever had changed in his daughter had a direction. And the direction pointed east, toward the Alderman fence line, toward the eastern field road she had taken to walking. His response to this recognition was the response of a man who has no language for his own emotional condition. He got louder. He moved toward the front of the county's mobilization. He wanted the notices. He wanted the meetings. He wanted the formal public mechanism of the county's authority brought to bear because the formal public mechanism of the county's authority was something he understood and could use, and the interior of his daughter's mind was neither. The county saw Whitmore's outrage and called it fatherly concern. That is one name for what it was. Walter Greer was a different kind of problem. He was the wealthiest man in the immediate county network, which meant he was also the most careful. Wealth at a certain level learns to be careful because it has more to lose, and Greer had been careful for so long it had become indistinguishable from his character. He was not frightened of Elijah Reed. This put him in a small minority. He was concerned about the county's reaction to Elijah Reed, which he recognized, with the clear-eyed instrumentalism of a man who thinks primarily in terms of system stability, as a force that could generate disorder if it was not carefully channeled. The disorder he feared was not moral. It was practical. Counties that became consumed by internal social alarm became unreliable, as business environments, as political entities, as networks of mutual interest and dependency. He had convened the May meeting not out of genuine alarm about what Elijah Reed had done, but out of genuine alarm about what the county was building itself into around the question of what Elijah Reed had done. He wanted it managed and concluded. He wanted the system's equilibrium restored. The solution he had selected, private notices, social containment, eventual sale, was the solution of a man who thinks in terms of levers rather than justice. You identify the element that is disrupting the system's function. You remove the element. The system returns to equilibrium. That the element was a human being was a fact that Greer's framework was built specifically not to require him to think about at any length. He hosted the meetings in the candlelit parlor of his house and spoke in the quiet, efficient language of men who are accustomed to making decisions that affect other people without consultation. He drafted the language of the notices with the care of an attorney, stripping out anything accusatory, keeping the language neutral and functional. Avoid prolonged contact. Notify immediately if observed nearby. These were his words. He chose them carefully. He was proud of their precision. He was not a monster. He was something that a county full of monsters can generate with great efficiency. A competent, practical man who made the machinery work without feeling required to think about what the machinery was doing. Cornelius Alderman was afraid of everyone in this story, which is perhaps the most revealing thing about him. He was afraid of his neighbor's judgment. He was afraid of the implication that his household had been a source of disruption. He was afraid of Franklin Cass, who had arrived in his front drive with the emotional temperature of a barn fire. He was afraid of Greer's quiet efficiency. He was afraid of what his wife's changed morning walks might mean if anyone asked about them, which so far no one had. He was, for most of this story, a man standing in the middle of a room trying to figure out which direction to face. He had spoken to Elijah Reed twice in 1853. Not long conversations. Not the kind that would have given him any real information about who Elijah was. Brief exchanges about work, about the property, about operational matters. In both exchanges, he had been acutely aware of the discomfort of looking at a man about whom the county had said so much and finding, in the actual man, so little evidence for the saying. He did not know what to do with that gap. So he did what he usually did with things he didn't know how to hold. He delegated the problem to the county's social consensus and tried to stay close to whatever the group decided. This is how the notices bearing Elijah Reed's description got Alderman's tacit endorsement. Not from conviction. From the fear of standing alone. It is not a flattering portrait. It is an accurate one. April arrived with rain that was hard and constant for the first 2 weeks, making the stable yard a problem of mud management and slowing the carriage work to the pace that wet wood and soaked leather impose. Elijah worked in the rain when the work required it and under the stable overhang when it didn't, and he moved through the daily choreography of the property with the unhurried precision that had always characterized his work. He noticed in April that Frances Alderman's morning walks had changed their route. He had not been watching for this. He was not tracking her movements or maintaining any inventory of where she walked. But a man who has spent 20 years as a precise reader of social environments does not stop reading them simply because he is occupied with other things. The change registered the way that all environmental changes register for such a person. Not dramatically, not with anything like alarm, but as information. A fact. Something to be noted and held alongside other facts, to be understood in context when the context became clear. He also noticed in April that Cornelius Alderman had started appearing near the stable yard at irregular times. Not working. Not supervising anything with any apparent purpose. Simply present. Standing at a distance, looking at the yard with the expression of a man trying to understand something from outside rather than by approaching it. These two changes, Francis's route shifting away, Cornelius arriving without purpose, told Elijah something. He did not know exactly what they told him. The full shape of the thing was still invisible. But you learn, in the life Elijah had lived, to read the approach of weather without needing to see the sky directly. You read it in the behavior of the animals, in the quality of the air, in the way people who are uncertain move. He was more careful in April. He did not become less attentive or less present in his work. That would have required becoming someone other than himself. But there was a slight additional layer of caution in the way he occupied the spaces of the property. A slight narrowing of his footprint. In May, one of the house workers, a woman named Bess who had been on the property for 3 years and who had always spoken with him easily, stopped speaking easily. The change was minute. The warmth was still technically present. But it had an effortful quality now, the warmth of someone who has been instructed to be careful and is being careful while maintaining the surface of ease. Elijah sat with that information. He did not know the word notices. He did not know the word in the specific sense that it was being used about him. The folded papers, the candlelit meetings, the coded language of men managing a problem they had decided he was. He did not have access to the parlors where those men sat. But he understood, from Bess's carefully maintained warmth, that something had been said somewhere that had changed the atmosphere. That a decision had been made by someone with authority, and that the decision's effects were now moving through the property's social fabric toward him. This is the specific loneliness of being managed by a system you can feel but cannot see. You know something is happening. You cannot identify it precisely enough to address it or defend against it. You can only continue to be visible, to do your work, to move through your days with the particular care of someone who understands that how they carry themselves matters and does not know exactly how it matters right now. Elijah carried himself with great care through the spring and summer of 1853. It did not help. He spoke to Hector about it in June, in the early morning before the day's work had begun, sitting on the step outside the stable with the sound of the horses moving inside. He did not speak directly. He said, "Have you noticed anything different lately? About the way things feel on this property?" Hector was 67 years old and had been on the alderman land since before Cornelius's father had died. He had survived by knowing exactly what he knew, exactly what he didn't know, and exactly what the gap between those two things required of him. He said, "I've noticed some things." Elijah said, "Can you tell me what you've noticed?" Hector was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've heard a name spoken in connection with yours. A few different names, actually. Women's names." Elijah was quiet too. "I don't understand it," he finally said. Not defensively. With the specific frustration of someone trying to work backwards from an effect to a cause and finding the causal chain unclear. "I've spoken to people. That's all I've done. I've had conversations. I don't know what's been built out of that." Hector looked at the sky. "You know it ain't about what you did." "I know," Elijah said. "But knowing the why doesn't change the what. And the what is getting louder." They sat with that in the early morning air. The horses moved inside. The light came up slowly over the eastern field. "What are you going to do?" Hector asked. Elijah said, "Watch. And think. And try to understand how much time I have." The October sermon was not an accident. Eustace Coleman had been preparing it for 3 weeks. Not the specific language, he was not a man who wrote his sermons word for word, but the architecture of it, the sequence of texts and implications that would allow him to say precisely what the county needed him to say without saying it in a form that could be quoted back to him as the specific targeting of a specific person. He was not a cruel man. It is important to say that, because the cruelty of what he did that Sunday was more disturbing if you understand that he was not cruel. He was a pastor managing a community in distress. He believed, genuinely, not as a performance, that his community was experiencing something that required spiritual address, and that the spiritual address required naming the category of danger without needing to name the specific instance of it. He chose Luke 17, the passage about stumbling blocks. He moved from there to a series of reflections on the nature of unguarded attention, on what it means for a household's spiritual health when a member of that household seeks counsel or comfort from a source outside the proper hierarchy of the home and the church. He spoke about the particular vulnerability of women to forms of influence that appeared as wisdom but operated as disruption. He was precise and he was measured, and every word he chose was chosen to land in a specific place in the mind of every person in that room. He said, "The thing that corrupts does not announce itself as corruption. It arrives in the form of interest, in the form of attention, in the form of being known. And when a woman begins to believe she is known by someone she should not be known by, the damage is already done, even before anything has happened that could be named." In the second pew, Winifred Coleman heard her husband deliver these words with the voice she had loved for 21 years. She smoothed her left glove. She smoothed her right glove. She looked at the back of the pew in front of her. She thought, he does not know that I spoke to Elijah Reed. He does not know that I found nothing there to be afraid of. He is describing a monster and I have seen the man and they are not the same. She thought, I cannot tell him this. She thought, and that inability, my inability to tell him what I actually saw, is exactly what this sermon is designed to produce. Behind her, Catherine Pryor was doing her own mathematics. Bowen was watching his wife. Whitmore was watching the pulpit with the expression of a man receiving confirmation. And somewhere in all of that watching and that smoothing and that calculating, the sermon did what it was designed to do. It gave the county's accumulated anxiety the shape of moral instruction. It moved it from the domain of rumor, which is unstable, which can be challenged, which has no authority beyond the social, into the domain of the church's authority, which in Rankin County in 1853 was the highest authority available. After the service, in the churchyard, in the conversations that formed and reformed in the warm October air, Elijah Reed's name was spoken more openly than it had been spoken anywhere in public since the spring. The sermon had done that. It had named the category. The county now felt permitted to fill it. A child named James Holloway, 7 years old, the son of the Holloway who had set down his fork at Whitmore's dinner in March, had heard things in his household that week that he did not fully understand. Children hear things that adults say in front of them on the premise that children do not understand the significance of what they hear. James Holloway had understood enough. Standing near the church steps with a group of adults who were not attending carefully to him, he said, to no one in particular, in the carrying voice of a 7-year-old, "Is Elijah Reed really going to be sold, like Papa said?" Several conversations stopped. His mother took his arm and moved him away with a speed and a grip that communicated, in terms a 7-year-old could understand, that he had said something that should not have been said. He did not understand why. He would remember it though. That quality of urgency in his mother's hand. Thomas Bowen, who had heard the child, turned to look at Walter Greer. Greer gave no expression in return. But the look between them said, the timeline has moved. Franklin Cass was the loudest man in the room in any room he entered. He was 40 years old, substantial in both physical dimensions and in the volume he occupied in the social atmosphere. He had strong feelings that moved quickly from formation to expression without the intervening process of examination that most people nominally attempt. He was not a reflective man. He was not required to be a reflective man because the life he had built, the property, the position, the marriage, did not require reflection. It required authority and momentum, and these he had in abundance. His wife Eleanor was 26 years old, quiet, devout, and possessed of an interior life that Franklin Cass had never once inquired about, not because he was incurious by disposition but because the possibility that his wife had an interior life requiring inquiry had not presented itself to him as a category of experience he needed to accommodate. Eleanor Cass had been planning to leave for approximately 8 months before she left. She had been precise about it in the way that people who are making irreversible decisions are precise, checking every detail multiple times, building redundancies into the plan, ensuring that the thing she was building could not collapse at the last moment through some overlooked detail. She had written to her cousin in Vicksburg. She had received a reply. She had exchanged 3 additional letters over the following months, establishing arrangements, establishing timing, establishing the specific conditions under which her cousin could receive her without requiring explanation to the broader social network. She had planned the horse, the coin, the timing. She had planned the walk she would take the morning she left, so that the departure would not register immediately as departure but simply as the morning walk of a woman whose morning walks were unremarkable. She had done none of this with any assistance from any other person on her plantation or in Rankin County. She had certainly done none of it with any assistance from Elijah Reed, whom she had spoken with exactly once, briefly, nearly 2 years earlier, in an exchange about a carriage repair that had lasted less than 5 minutes. She left on a Tuesday in the first week of August. Her horse was gone by the time the household noticed. By the time Franklin Cass understood what had happened, that his wife had not simply taken an early ride but had taken an early ride that she did not intend to return from, it was midday and she had 8 hours of head start. He spent 2 hours in a state of private emotional violence that the property's workers observed from careful distances. Then he rode to the Alderman Plantation. The reason he rode to the Alderman Plantation was this. Somewhere in the 6 months since the county had begun its story about Elijah Reed, Franklin Cass had been in enough conversations, at enough gatherings, to have absorbed the story's shape without ever having consciously decided to believe it. This is how ambient information works. It does not require a moment of conviction. It simply accumulates until, in the presence of a crisis requiring rapid explanation, it presents itself as the obvious answer. His wife was gone. There was a man the county had been quietly deciding was dangerous to women. The connection formed itself in under a minute. He arrived at the Alderman property at the kind of speed that a large man with emotional momentum and a fast horse generates, and Cornelius Alderman came out of his house to meet him with the expression of a man who has been expecting some version of this and is not entirely sure how to handle it. What followed was the scene the property's workers observed. Cass demanding Elijah be produced, Alderman refusing, voices rising, the exchange acquiring the quality of a confrontation that was close to crossing a line it had not yet crossed. Hector, from the doorway of the stable, watched. Several of the field workers coming in from the eastern property had stopped at the edge of the yard and were watching from the distance that survival teaches. Elijah inside the stable could hear the voices. He did not move. He was very still on the overturned crate he was sitting on, in the particular way of a man who has been waiting for something to arrive and is now assessing the full shape of what it is. He had not seen Eleanor Cass in over a week. He had not spoken to Eleanor Cass in over a month. He had nothing whatsoever to do with her departure, and he knew this with the complete clarity of simple fact. He also knew, with equal clarity, that the complete clarity of simple fact was not a tool available to him in this situation. He could not walk out into that yard and say, "I had nothing to do with this woman's disappearance, and here is the evidence for that claim." He had no access to the machinery of evidence. He had no standing in the legal or social structures that might evaluate evidence. He was exactly as visible to those structures as they required him to be, and not 1 degree more. Alderman, ultimately, sent Cass away without producing Elijah. This was not justice. It was property law. Alderman controlled what was on his property, and he was not going to hand that control to another man's emotional momentum. Cass left. The yard was quiet again. Elijah stayed on the crate for a long time after that. He was thinking about time. About how much of it he had. Eleanor Cass was found 4 days later in Vicksburg at her cousin's house. The sequence of news reaching Rankin County was, in retrospect, a textbook study in how a community manages information that does not fit its story. The first news, that Eleanor had been found, created a brief, involuntary lightening of the atmosphere. The second piece of news, that she had left voluntarily, that she had planned it, that there was correspondence establishing her intentions and her arrangements, created something more complicated. Because this information did not exonerate Elijah Reed from the county's perspective. It removed the specific accusation. It did not remove the general suspicion, which the county had been building for months on a foundation entirely independent of Eleanor Cass and which did not require her to have been taken in order to remain structurally sound. What the county did with Eleanor Cass's actual story, with the correspondence, with the evidence of a woman who had planned her escape from a difficult marriage with considerable intelligence and patience, was to treat it as a separate matter. Her circumstances were discussed privately, with varying degrees of sympathy and condemnation. Her decision was processed through the available social categories, none of which fitted exactly. And Elijah Reed remained, in the county's atmosphere, the figure he had been before Eleanor Cass disappeared and the figure he had been when she disappeared. The accusation dissolved. The shape the accusation had temporarily occupied did not. Margaret Sayers, hearing this processing happen around her, sat at her own dinner table 3 days after Eleanor Cass was found and said to her husband, "They've removed him from the Eleanor Cass story and they've kept the story. Does that not tell you something?" Edward Sayers looked at his soup. He said, "Yes, it tells me something." She said, "What does it tell you?" He said, "It tells me this has never been about what he did." There was a long pause. "Then what has it been about?" she asked. He said, slowly, in the tone of a careful man thinking a thought to its end for the first time, "I think it's been about what he revealed. About everyone else. If you have been listening for this long, you already understand something important. This stopped being about Elijah Reed's behavior quite early. The county never fully noticed when that happened. It had been telling itself a particular story for so long that the story's relationship to the original facts became irrelevant. If you know which side of that argument you're on, whether you think Elijah knew exactly what he was doing, or whether you think the county built its nightmare out of its own material, leave it in the comments. This question has never had a clean answer. I want to know where you land. It was September when Adelaide Whitmore finally had the conversation with her father that had been building since spring. It did not begin as a confrontation. It began as dinner, which in the Whitmore household was always a performance of the family's functioning, with her father occupying the head of the table and the position of the conversation's authority, and her mother occupying the side with the expression of a woman who has learned to be present without being a surface for anything to land on. Her father said something about the notices. He said it obliquely. He had been saying most things about this obliquely for months, referring to the arrangements being finalized for the alderman situation and indicating, with the tone of a man communicating a matter settled and closed, that the conclusion was near. Adelaide set down her fork. She said, "What specifically did he do?" The table's atmosphere changed with the speed of these things, the specific social electricity of a question that has crossed a line simply by being asked. Her father looked at her. "Adelaide," she said, "I'm asking a direct question. What specific thing did he do that justifies what is being done?" Her mother looked at her plate. Garrett Whitmore said, "That is not a question for this table." She said, "It seems like the most important question for any table where what is being done is being discussed and approved." "I will not. I walked on the Eastern Field Road," she said. Her voice was completely level. She had been planning this conversation for weeks, the way she planned everything, carefully with attention to the exact point at which the first break had occurred so that the repair started in the right place. "I spoke with him twice. Both conversations were brief and both were entirely appropriate. And I have spent the last 6 months watching this county build an architecture of accusation and social management around a man who had conversations with women, and I would like someone at this table to tell me what the conversations contained that required all of this." Whitmore was on his feet. He was not a man who remained seated when the situation required him to feel the full height of his authority. He said things. There were several sentences. They concerned her reputation, her judgment, her understanding of the world she lived in, and the specific duty of a young woman in her position to trust the assessments of her father about what was and was not appropriate. Adelaide listened to all of it. Then she said quietly, "He talked about fence repair. That is what the conversation contained. He said that if you fix the second break before you understand the first, you've only moved the problem." And I think about that sentence regularly because it is the most useful thing anyone has said to me in this county in years. The silence that followed this was the particular silence of a man who has heard something that has done damage in him and is not yet ready to acknowledge what the damage is. Adelaide picked her fork back up. She ate the rest of her dinner without speaking. Her father did not speak either. Her mother looked at her plate. After dinner, alone in her room, Adelaide sat at the window and looked at the dark eastern field in the direction she could no longer walk. She was not crying. She was thinking, clearly and precisely, in the way she had always thought, in the way that her father's household had worked very hard to prevent her from knowing she was capable of. She was thinking he was right about the fence. And the county has been repairing the second break for months. And I do not know how to fix the first one. She did not know the answer to that. She was 22 years old in 1853 Mississippi, and she did not have the tools. The tools would not exist in any form available to her for a very long time. But she had asked the question out loud. At the family dinner table. In the presence of the county's institutional authority, as embodied by her father. She had asked it. It had been heard. It had not been answered. That is not nothing. October moved toward November. The harvest was in. The cotton weight numbers were being discussed in the county's commercial channels with the intensity that this discussion always generated. The comparison of yields, the calculation of factors, the assessment of what the season had produced relative to what had been hoped. The plantation economy, in its seasonal rhythm, had turned a corner, and with the corner came the particular contracted sociality of a community that has performed its summer obligations and is now permitted to draw inward toward the domestic. Elijah Reed was moving through October with the specific quality of attention of a man who has understood that a timeline is in motion. He did not know the details. He did not know about the sales conversations that aldermen had been having with buyers in neighboring counties, the letters, the inquiries, the careful broker exchanges that were the machinery of the property system operating in its most efficient, most administrative mode. He did not have access to those letters. But he had Hector. And Hector, who had been on this land for 40 years and who understood the sounds the property made when it was changing, came to him in the second week of October and sat with him in the early morning and said, without preamble, "There's been talk of a sale." Elijah was quiet. "When?" he said. "Before the end of the year is what I've heard," Hector said. "Don't know more than that." They sat with it. "Is there anything you can do?" Hector asked. Elijah looked at the eastern field. The cotton was picked. The stalks were brown and stripped, and the field had the exhausted, honest quality of land that has given everything it had for the year. "I've been thinking about that," he said, "for a while now. And I think the answer is that the only thing I can do is the thing they'll use to justify what they've already decided to do anyway." He was quiet for another moment. So the question is actually different. The question is whether I stay and let the machinery take me where it's going to take me, or whether I take the machinery out of the equation. Hector understood what this meant. He had understood it was coming for some time. He said, "You've been planning." Elijah said, "I've been watching. For a long time. I know where the roads go. I know the schedule of this property and I know the schedules of the properties around it. I know who watches and when they watch and when they stop watching." He paused. 20 years of paying attention. It had to be useful for something. Hector was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "When?" Elijah said, "When the window is open. I'll know it." They did not speak about it again. There was an understanding between them that functioned below language. The specific understanding of two men who have spent decades in the same enclosed world and have learned to communicate in the frequencies that world leaves open. Hector went back to his work. Elijah went back to his. The work was the same as it had always been. He repaired what needed repairing. He trained what needed training. He moved through the days of October with the unhurried precision that had always characterized him, and if there was something slightly different in the quality of his attention now, something that moved in the evenings over the geography of the property and beyond it, taking careful inventory, it would not have been visible to anyone who was not watching him the way he had spent 20 years watching others. He was mapping his exit. Not frantically. Not in the desperate, improvised fashion of a man making decisions under immediate pressure. Carefully. Methodically. The way you approach a broken thing when you want to understand which break came first. He identified the window in the second week of November. Alderman had left for 3 days of business in Jackson. Elijah knew the schedule because he had made the preparations for the carriage that carried him there. Several of the overseers were engaged in the post-harvest accounting that occupied their attention in early November. The nights had grown long. There was a section of the property's eastern boundary, past the sweet gum stand where the land went low and waterlogged, that was essentially unwatched because it was essentially unworkable. He knew all of this. He had known all of this for a long time. On the night of November the 14th, or what the limited record suggests was that night, he laid down on his pallet in the workers' quarters at the usual time. He was still. He listened to the sounds of the property settling toward sleep. He waited. At some point in the deep middle of the night he rose. He had almost nothing to take because he had almost nothing to leave behind. The things he had accumulated over a decade at this property were the kind of things that could not travel. The knowledge of the land, the familiarity of the stable yard, the specific location of every loose board and soft patch of ground in the approach to the eastern boundary. The understanding of which horses would make noise and which would not. He did not take a horse. A missing horse would be noticed at dawn. He went on foot, through the dark, through the sweet gum stand, through the low ground where the land went wet and cold under his feet, through the boundary and beyond it. He did not look back. This is not romanticism. He did not look back because looking back served no purpose. He had already looked at the property and the people on it and the years he had spent there with everything he had. He had already understood it as thoroughly as it could be understood. The understanding was in him now. It did not require the direction of the house. He moved north. He moved in the way that a man who has been paying attention for 20 years moves through geography that he has studied from a distance. Recognizing what he encounters, adjusting, continuing. In the morning, the Alderman property did not yet know he was gone. By midday it did. The county's response to Elijah Reed's disappearance was, in its way, the most revealing episode of the entire story. It was not, primarily, a practical response. There were searches, of a sort, riders sent to neighboring properties, inquiries dispatched through the same networks that had distributed the notices. But the searches had a curious quality of going through the motions. The machinery engaged and then stalled in ways that might, in another case, have been attributed to incompetence, but that an observer with any clarity would have recognized as something else. The something else was this. A significant portion of Rankin County did not know what it wanted to find. Not because they wished Elijah Reed well. Most of them had no relationship to his actual well-being that would generate that kind of wish. But because the question of what to do with him, if found, was suddenly and uncomfortably complicated. The notices had not constituted a legal accusation. The Eleanor Cass episode had definitively removed the one specific incident that had looked, briefly, like concrete ground for action. What remained was the accumulated social story about him, which was real in the sense that the county believed it but which had no form that could be entered into a legal proceeding or defended in any official channel. If they found him and brought him back, the question of what to charge him with would require answering. It turned out to be easier, in a way the county did not consciously acknowledge but clearly felt, to let the absence stand. The sales arrangements that Alderman had been conducting were quietly concluded in a form that did not require Elijah Reed's physical presence. The property relationship was terminated through documentation, through ledger entries that removed his notation from the inventory, through the administrative procedure that the property system had developed for exactly these situations. He was, in the record, transferred. Where he was transferred to was a notation that would not survive cleanly into any archive. He was gone. The paperwork closed around the space he had occupied and sealed it. And the county, deprived of the specific occasion for its story, did what communities do with stories they cannot conclude. It converted him into legend. The legend was larger than anything that had happened. In the legend, he had spoken with more women over a longer period with greater intimacy. The conversations had been more dangerous, more deliberate, more tinged with the specific quality that made them inappropriate. His intelligence had been more calculated. His influence had been more sustained. The disruption he had generated had been more severe. None of this was accurate. All of it was believed. The legend was what you get when a community has invested too much in a story to release it at its actual size. The story needs to be large enough to justify the response. The response was large. Therefore the story grew to meet it. What the legend preserved, accidentally, through a kind of inadvertent accuracy, was the essential truth. That his presence had changed something in the people who had been near him. That something was visible, was real, had produced effects that outlasted him, and that the households involved were still, in various quiet ways, navigating. The legend said this and was wrong about the cause. The truth said this and was right about the mechanism. Catherine Pryor wrote, in November of 1853, in the journal that would survive her, "He is gone, and the county speaks of his absence as though it is a conclusion. I do not feel concluded. I feel more clearly than I have in some time. That feeling came from something his presence briefly illuminated and something his absence has not extinguished. The county will call what I feel by several names, none of them accurate. I have decided to use the word I choose. I feel awake. And I wonder what I am supposed to do with that." Delia Hargrove, the merchant's wife, finished her letter to her sister in Virginia and sealed it. She would never know that it would survive them both. Frances Alderman resumed her morning walks in the spring of 1854. The route was different from either of the routes she had used before. It was shorter. It led south toward the road and then turned back. It passed nothing that could remind her of anything in particular. This was, perhaps, a kind of conclusion. Or perhaps it was a continuation of the same avoidance in a different direction. She did not examine it closely. Some things in 1853 Mississippi were safer not examined. Adelaide Whitmore married in 1855 and moved to her husband's property in an adjacent county. The marriage was described by her father as satisfactory, which was one way of describing a transaction. She took her books with her. She took the habit of walking the eastern perimeter of whatever property she found herself on, looking at fence lines with the particular attention of someone who has been taught, once in a brief conversation on a field road, that you cannot understand a break until you find where the thing first gave way. Eleanor Cass did not return to Rankin County. Her subsequent history is not part of the county's record. She wrote to her cousin again in December of 1853, a letter that has not survived. She was last documented in Vicksburg in 1854. After that, the record does not find her. Ruth Chastain lived until 1869. The testimony gathered from her in the last years of her life, by a Freedmen's Bureau researcher who was trying to understand the social history of the county in the antebellum period, contains her account of Elijah, her account of the county's story, and the sentence she had been carrying since 1852. Repetition without attention gets tedious. Repetition with attention is something different. She said she had never found a reason to revise this. That it seemed to her correct about almost everything. Elijah Reed does not appear again in any record that has been found. He may have reached the north. He may have reached Canada. He may have built a life under a different name in a city that had no memory of Rankin County. He may have been taken. He may have been sold again elsewhere, under the documentation that erased him from the alderman ledger and reinscribed him somewhere the archive has not yet found. What is known is that he was never returned to Mississippi. The window he had identified was real. He had moved through it with the precise efficiency of a man who had spent 20 years paying attention. There is a kind of history that leaves buildings and documents and names in the archive. That history is easier to tell. And there is a kind of history that leaves impressions, shapes pressed into the people who were present, alterations in the way those people moved through the years that followed, changes in the quality of their attention and the content of their private thoughts. That history is harder to find. It does not announce itself. It lives in journals and letters and in the testimony of old people remembering small moments that they have never stopped finding significant. Elijah Reed left the second kind. The county of Rankin built a legend around him and used the legend to manage the discomfort of what he had actually been. The legend was about danger, about the specific racially charged danger of an enslaved black man whose quality of intelligence and attention had crossed the social boundaries that the county required him to stay behind. That is the legend's content, and it is worth naming clearly, because naming clearly is the only honest response to a mechanism that depends on remaining unnamed. The truth was something the legend was specifically designed to prevent the county from having to hold. The truth was that a man who listened, who was genuinely, fully present with people in the specific way that the structure of that world did not permit most people to be present with anyone, had briefly illuminated, by contrast, the vast emotional absence that the structure had created in almost everyone around him. That the women who had spoken with him had not been seduced or manipulated or influenced in the way that the county's story required. They had encountered, briefly and surprisingly, what it felt like to be attended to. They had carried that encounter with them. It had changed things in them. And the county had built a monster rather than ask what the change revealed. This is not a story from the past. The mechanism is not dated. The process by which communities construct danger out of what makes them uncomfortable, out of the qualities in a person that, by their very existence, make visible the inadequacy of the system around them, this process does not require 1853 to operate. It requires only fear and investment in a particular arrangement of things, and the willingness to let those two elements do the work that reason and honesty would do less comfortably. The private notices still circulate. The language has changed. The channels have changed. The mechanism is familiar. Elijah Reed was a man who listened. He was extraordinary at it because his survival had required him to be, and because the capacity for attention, once developed by necessity, does not remain merely tactical. It becomes a way of being in the world. He listened to the women who spoke to him, and they felt heard, and what they felt in the feeling of being heard revealed to them, in brief and disorienting flashes, what they had not been feeling in every other room. That is the whole of it. He never fully understood the effect he had. He understood it was happening, in the way he understood the approach of weather, before he understood its specific content. And when the content became clear, when the county's story reached him in the fragments available to him, he understood it not with anger but with the particular, tired clarity of a man who recognizes a system operating exactly as it was designed to operate. He understood the why. He found the first break. And then he moved through the opening in the sweet gum stand in the November dark and went north, carrying everything he had ever understood about the world, which was considerable, and the name that would become legend in a county that had never known the half of it. There are names in the margins of this archive. There are people who lived in the space between the ledger's categories and left their mark in the impressions they made on others, in the quality of attention they brought to a world that mostly tried to prevent them from being seen. Unmarked history was built for them. For the people who changed things quietly, without courtrooms or proclamations, through the simple and radical act of being more fully present in a world that needed it than the world knew how to hold. Subscribe and stay. There are more of them. Was Elijah Reed dangerous, or was he simply impossible to control? The county never settled that question. Neither should you settle it too quickly. Leave your reading in the comments. And send this to someone who thinks deeply about how societies build the monsters they need. That conversation is exactly why this channel exists.